At Night All Blood is Black. Cat hair. This is proper good. At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop won the International Booker Prize 2021, and I read it. I did a video when the long list of the International Booker Prize was announced, and I was so disheartened and embarrassed because I didn't know a lot of the books on the list. I think I had read 2 of them, if I remember rightly, by the time that video went up. I've since read a few more, and my favourite from the entire long list is definitely The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez, translated by Megan McDowell, I think. But this won it. At Night All Blood is Black. It's published by Pushkin Press, and I have a wonderful relationship with Pushkin Press. I've mentioned in many videos that I love pretty much everything that they put out, whether it's in translation or not. They are a reliably excellent publisher of usually quite short, lovely little books, and I love them. This is translated from French by Anna Moschovakis, and I've definitely never read any of her translations before. I would remember that name, but it's a really poetic and beautiful translation job from her. David Diop is a black French Senegalese writer, and he's also an academic, and this is a book that is set during World War I. I remember when it was announced on the Booker long list, it sounded like one of the better books on the list, and then it was shortlisted, and then it won. Very exciting. I really enjoyed this book. I understand why it won. It is exactly the kind of book to win a prize. It is heavily thematic. It is very literary, it explores very large themes, and it's exploring things that are very topical, continuously relevant and topical themes, including racism, classism, masculinity, war in general. All of these things are explored here. At Night All Blood is Black tells the story of one Senegalese soldier during World War I. He and his childhood best friend decide to enlist in the French army and go fight in the trenches against the Germans in World War I. The book opens with his friend lying on the floor and dying. His guts are spilled out, and it is very gruesomely detailed. The friend is called Mademba, and our protagonist is Alpha, and Mademba is begging Alpha to kill him. He says, please, cut my throat. I cannot slowly die here, losing blood like this. Please just kill me. And Alpha can't do it. He cannot bring himself to kill his best friend, so instead he leaves his childhood friend to slowly die in his arms, and once the friend is dead, Alpha walks back to the trenches. And this haunts him. As it happens, Alpha remarks to us, as the narrator, he says, if this had happened now, if Mademba had been mortally wounded now, I would now have the guts. Guts, it's not funny. To kill him. But at the time I didn't. Because that is what war has done to me. This is a book about losing your humanity, but it's more than that. There have been a lot of books about how war changes us and we lose our humanity to it. And it is an infinitely fascinating topic. What war does to us, what trauma does to us, what the limits of our humanity are, and from whose perspective that is. Like, who gets to decide what losing your humanity even means? Because I think it probably depends on what culture you're from, what culture you were raised in, your religious background, political background. There's a lot of things wrapped up in the concept of humanity and the soul and morality, etc. And that, again, is explored here. That's probably why this is such an interesting take on that concept of losing your humanity, because racism is bound up in that discussion in this book. It's kind of difficult to talk about it without spoiling things. I won't talk about the second half of the book at all, but it's tiny. It's 130 pages. I read it in an afternoon. It's a very quick read. I just sat in the garden, listened to an album, and tore through it. And it's really good for eating. It's really good for, I was going to say eating again, reading in one sitting. I shouldn't be laughing. It's a very traumatic experience. But it lends itself to that quickly digested kind of a, maybe I'm hungry, kind of a read. Once Alpha loses his friend, he goes back to the trenches. He doesn't speak French, so he's very alone in the trenches with all the other French soldiers. But there are other West African soldiers in the trenches with them, and they are referred to by the French as the chocolat soldiers, because they're black. So racism plays a part. What's interesting, and I think it's the most interesting thing that happens in the book, and it happens early on and gets explored as the story goes, so I'm happy to talk about it here, is that Alpha does something that he then kind of makes a habit of, which is that when he goes out fighting against the Germans, he kills a soldier and cuts off their hand. And he brings the hand back as a kind of a trophy. And the first 3 times that he does this, he's praised and he gets a slap on the back and a round of applause from all the men. And as soon as he brings back the 4th one, all the men go, ugh, that's weird. He's weird. And they kind of ostracize him. And he's suddenly seen as a freak, as an inhuman, bloodthirsty animal. And of course, the reason that they jump to this conclusion so quickly is racism. He is a Senegalese soldier, he does not speak their language, he's from another continent, he's of a different race, and this stereotype of African people being more tribal, being more bloodthirsty, being more savage. These are all racist terms, they're all stereotypes, they're all offensive, and they continue to be relevant even to today. And that's the reason that the French soldiers are all judging him. There are other relationships in the book as well, which I won't go into detail about, but they all broach different themes, morals, and topics. The story is also not told in a strictly chronological order. As the book goes on into the second half, we actually start moving back in time. It is a very dark and visceral story, but of course, you would expect that. It's a book about the traumas of war. Of course, you're going to see the traumas of war. It's also a book about toxic masculinity. The way that the other men treat Alpha in the trenches, and even the way that Alpha behaves. He's not an entirely good person. His relationship with Mademba, his relationship with the other soldiers, it's all so toxic. This is about how men goad each other on, how men dare each other to do things, how men judge each other for certain actions, thoughts, statements. There are a lot of references to women as prizes. When we flash back to the past, we learn a bit about Alpha and Mademba and the women in their village. I won't give you any specifics, but there's a lot of toxic masculinity here at play, and it is very, very rigidly explored. Alpha's relationship with Mademba reeks of that brotherhood, camaraderie thing that war kind of romanticizes. This thing about men feeling like war gives them a purpose, something that allows them to bond with their fellow men, as if they need an excuse for that, as if they couldn't do that by just talking, but instead they have to fight side by side and boast and compete in a bloody tournament. And all of that is explored here. There's a lot going on in 130 pages. This is a story about racism. It's a story about nationalism. It's a story about masculinity. And as we've seen a lot in the last few years with an increasingly conservative world, masculinity and nationalism are tightly interwoven together. This feeling of superiority, this competition between peoples and nations and races and cultures, this thing that seems to be getting worse, is what makes this such a topical read. And I highly recommend it, but it is experimental in its style, in its telling, and it is very, very dark and bleak. Also, as I said, Anna Moschovakis has done an incredible job translating this. It is a wonderfully poetic book. There are these motifs that get repeated through the book, these phrases that are repeated again and again by Alpha or just in the narration, and they reinforce the themes and topics and ideas of the book. You'll catch them as you go, and this capturing of these motifs and ideas is so beautifully done in the translation, as is the kind of poetic nature of the book. The way that Alpha speaks, he has these certain turns of phrase, he has this certain way of narrating his information to us that allows us to inspect his character and personality in a really detailed way, and the way that he looks at, judges, and kind of reports to us about the other soldiers in the trenches, and his friend Mademba, and his past and his backstory. It's all so lush in its description, absolutely beautiful. It's a book you could easily read 2, 3, 4 times and glean more from it. It's a very literary novel, and I hugely recommend it for that reason, but it is pretty intense and it's very, very dark, so just be warned. I totally understand why it won the Booker Prize. It is very, very topical, As I've repeatedly said, the themes of this book are very, very topical right now. And I think in the same way that Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club explores masculinity and war and violence and aggression, this does a very similar thing and also mixes race into the mix. So wow, well done to David Diop. This is a very intense and dark examination of humanity, especially masculinity, especially racial divides and divides in general. It's kind of what it's about. It's a book about binaries and two sides and oppositions and people facing each other down. It's a very us and them, in-group and out-group exploration, and it does that through more than just war. It does it through race and masculinity as well, and it really delivers. At Night or Blood is Black is well worth a read. Well done, David Diop. Well done, Pushkin Press. Well done, Anna Moschovakis. I'm glad that this won. I do think it's deserved. Go read it and subscribe for books.